This emboldened Cage to move onto the more ambitious music of changes for piano. 45 minutes of difficult piano music that would be his first major work, completely derived from this idea of silence and chants. It was composed using chants throughout, from start to finish, and every dimension of the music, sounds, silences, rhythms, dynamics, densities, and tempi, all sort of were based on this process. Drawing upon the virtuosity of David Tudor, Cage used his compositional process to generate a wide variety of musical events, piled up at times in layers. The piece, while coming from a structure of silent time, is bursting with sound, effusive, bubbles over with energy, and at times it becomes very quiet and delicate. Then it becomes ferocious, thundering and sharp. So it's this amazing rhythm of sound coming out of completely chance. He didn't decide when it gets more thunderous or more quiet. It's all based on chance. So he sort of thought it was a miracle of invention through this process. Taking its title from the I Ching, Book of Changes, it was the beginning of Cage's lifelong use of the I Ching, this oracle of chance operations. Soon thereafter, Cage began attending lectures on Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki at Columbia University, developing the ideas of non-intention through chance and the plenum of silence into a complete theoretical and methodological position. One of the most important origin stories in the Cagean repertoire is that of his 1951 visit to an anechoic chamber at Harvard University. This supposedly silent environment, a space from which echoes are technologically removed, in this space, Cage proceeded to, in a sense, defy technology with his listening capabilities, managing to hear, after a while, two distinct sounds: his blood in circulation and his nervous system in operation. If the identification of these usually imperceptible sounds seems a little far-fetched, Cage anticipated this reaction. So in later retellings of this story, he relinquished his own claim to the story, the diagnosis, and instead attributed it to an engineer at Harvard. So he sort of figured, I mean, it does sound really extreme, oh, I heard my blood moving around my body. So instead he asked the Harvard, what were those sounds? And the guy told him this. So he was able to quote him, which is sort of interesting, the way Cage uses a strategy of someone with technical knowledge to prove the point he wanted to make anyway, essentially. So from this account, he began to develop his theory of silence as a framework for active listening. Cage made the event critical because of what he said about it and how he made it work for his project at large. As he retold the story, the point became that in a space where all the sound is removed, one still hears something. Sounds one does not intentionally make. Sounds one doesn't intend. And therefore, that all sound can be not governed by intentionality. Transferring this revelation onto the evolving conceptions of his work, Cage launched a particularly clear critique of intentionality, relativizing the primacy of structure in composing, rhythmic structure in composing. So that's suddenly not the most important thing anymore. And with an extraordinary model of space, the space of the anechoic chamber, as a technological architecture determining his definition of oral experience unfolding in time, Cage had a tabula rasa for composing going forward. The value of the anechoic chamber event is that it made sonic space physical. It made the non-intentional palpable, and crucially, it ushered in the new theoretical premises under the auspices of technology. So he used a piece of technology in 1952 to speak about his aims and ambitions. This is a very influential thing to do at that point in time. When we'd forgotten how low-tech things were in 1952. A critical aspect of Cage's account is that the protagonist, a composer, had an experience of sound that he could not identify or predict. It is not a mere detail in the story that he deferred to this Harvard engineer. This is the expert explanation of sound under silent conditions that Cage would use to authorise his next moves. So he could push forward with his theory of silence because he had a really important explanation. The complete story, which Cage developed retroactively, sort of progressively, generated a profound logic for Cage's next two landmark scores, which were Imaginary Landscape No. 4, which had 12 radios in 1951, and the very famous 433, which you see here. I might just go back to that for a second. Cage's most famous score, 433, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, is at the heart of the most comprehensive period of change in his oeuvre. The statement of 433, an empty score with only a temporal framework, gave Cage a stunning assertion of silence, a material and structural form. Asking audiences to use the temporal frame to focus their listening, Cage in effect realised the contained silence of the anechoic chamber as a score, sutured in perpetuity to a changing world of sounds. 433 developed both with Cage's rhetoric and with what he needed the score to accomplish as the decade unfolded. Cage would self-criticise his own Music of Changes, the 1951 work, for its not having taken chance operations far enough, and particularly not taking them beyond the sphere of composing. All the chance in this piece is in the composition stage, right? So that is, what it didn't do is take chance into the realm of performance and reception. 433 asserted the Cagean concept developed in the 50s that a score is an object, not a process. Not an object, it's a process. Even the work itself was a process. It changed format over the years as Cage's own ideas developed and achieved more clarity. So the first version of 433, composed in 1952, and I think this is a real revelation of the exhibition, by the way, that splitting this up into several versions. So, because everyone always collapses 433 into one thing. So if you think about it, it wasn't just one thing, it was a mobile conceptual object. So the first version of 433, composed in 1952, was written as grand staff notation, as exactly the same as Music of Changes and Imaginary Landscape No. 4, which people never put all together normally. In 1953, it was recast in proportional notation, where 1/8 of an inch equaled 1 second. And this was the score that, as we'll see in a minute, was when Cage made the connection to Rauschenberg's white paintings. And the final version, which would be transformed into pure text, so its movements read tacit, tacit, tacit. And for those of you who aren't music people, tacit means don't do anything if you're in an orchestra. Don't pick up your instrument. This one came as Cage was establishing indeterminacy at the beginning of 1958.